At 3:47 a.m., the call came in. I recall attempting to understand the words coming through my phone while I stared at the red numbers on my bedside clock. James, my father's business partner, was talking too quickly, and his voice was breaking. "There was an accident, Alara. The cops located your parents' vehicle off of Mountain Pass Road. I'm so sorry." That call signaled the beginning of the end for my meticulously built world. My name is Alara. Long after James had hung up, I sat there in the dark, holding my phone tightly. The only sound in the house was Griffin's steady breathing next to me. I couldn't force myself to wake my spouse, who hadn't moved during the call, but I needed these brief minutes of alone to take in what I had heard. According to the police, it was a horrible accident, brake failure on a hazardous road. But my father had always maintained his cars with great care. Always. I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, my bare feet silent against the cold tiles. The familiar space felt foreign in the pre-dawn darkness. As I reached for a glass of water, my hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. "Mom?" Rowan's voice startled me. My 18-year-old son stood in the doorway, looking younger than usual in his oversized t-shirt. "What's wrong?" I turned away, buying time by filling my glass. "Your grandparents." The words stuck in my throat. "There's been an accident." "What kind of accident?" His voice sharpened with worry. Before I could answer, Griffin appeared behind him. My husband's normally perfect hair was tousled from sleep, but his eyes were alert, too alert for someone who'd just woken up. "What's going on?" Griffin asked, though something in his tone made me wonder if he already knew. I told him about the call. As I spoke, Griffin's expression shifted from concern to something else, something calculating. He placed a hand on my shoulder, but his next words made my skin crawl. "We should call the lawyer first thing in the morning. Make sure everything's in order with the estate." Rowan shot his father a disgusted look. "Really, Dad? That's your first thought?" "It's practical." Griffin defended himself. "Your mother's not thinking clearly right now. Someone needs to handle the business side of things." I shrugged off his hand. "My parents are dead, Griffin." "They're dead, and you're talking about their money." "I'm trying to help," he insisted, but there was an edge to his voice I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I just never wanted to notice it. The rest of that night passed in a blur. I made calls to my sister overseas, to family friends, to the funeral home. Griffin hovered nearby, always listening, always offering to handle things. Each time he spoke about practical matters, something cold settled deeper in my stomach. Around dawn, I found myself alone in my father's study, surrounded by photos of happier times. One caught my eye. My parents at their 40th anniversary party last month. Dad was laughing at something Mom had said, his hand protectively on her back. They looked so alive, so vital. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Need to talk to you alone. Important. Your father left me something to give you." Before I could respond, Griffin appeared in the doorway. "The lawyer can see us at 9, he announced. "I've already called the insurance company too. Everything will be taken care of." I looked up at my husband of 20 years. Really looked at him. And for the first time, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and those eyes were fixed on the framed photos of my family's estate. "Thank you," I said quietly, but in my mind, I was already making plans to meet James alone. Something wasn't right here, and I needed to find out what my father had wanted me to know. As Griffin left the study, I heard him on the phone, speaking too softly to make out the words. But one thing was becoming clear. The accident that killed my parents might not have been accident at all. 2 weeks after my parents' funeral, I found myself staring at a wedding invitation. Not just any wedding invitation. My son's. The cream-colored paper trembled in my hands as I read the date. Next weekend. Rowan was getting married next weekend, and he hadn't even told me in person. I found him in the garage, working on his car the same way my father used to work on his. The thought made my chest tight. Were you planning to tell me? I asked, holding up the invitation. Rowan slid out from under the car. Grease smeared across his cheek. His eyes flickered to the paper, then away. Dad said he'd handle it. Of course he did. Griffin had been handling everything lately. Your father doesn't get to handle this, Rowan. You're my son. Why didn't you tell me yourself? He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. Because I knew you tried to talk me out of it. You're 18, Rowan. You've known Ivy for what, 3 months? 4, he corrected, as if that made it better. And I love her. The garage door opened, and Griffin walked in, followed by a petite girl with long dark hair, Ivy. She smiled sweetly, but something about that smile made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There you are. Griffin's voice was too cheerful. I was just showing Ivy the property plans. Did you know she has quite a knack for real estate? The property plans? I echoed. For my parents' estate? Griffin waved his hand dismissively. Just thinking ahead. Family planning, you know. We're not even through probate yet. My voice came out sharper than intended. Ivy stepped forward, linking her arm through Rowan's. I hope I'm not causing any trouble. We just want to start our life together, don't we, honey? Rowan nodded, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he looked away. Why don't we all have dinner together? Griffin suggested. Talk things through like family. An hour later, we sat around our dining room table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Griffin had ordered expensive takeout using my parents' credit card, which he somehow had access to now. So, Ivy, I said, watching her push food around her plate, tell me about your family. Oh, it's just me, she said quickly. My parents. They're not in the picture. That must be hard, I said, noting how she avoided eye contact. Where did you say you went to school? I didn't, she replied. Then quickly added, I was homeschooled. Griffin cleared his throat. Ivy had a difficult past, Alara. Let's not interrogate the poor girl. I'm not interrogating anyone. I'm trying to get to know my future daughter-in-law. Mom. Rowan warned. What about college plans? I pressed. You and Rowan. Actually, Griffin interrupted. I've been talking to Rowan about joining me in the family business. I sat down my fork. What family business? You work in sales. Not anymore. Griffin smiled. I've been looking into taking over your father's company. The board seems quite receptive to the idea. The room started spinning. You what? It makes sense, he continued. Keep it in the family. Rowan can learn the ropes eventually. Take over. Stop. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Just stop. My father's body isn't even cold, and you're all. Mom. Rowan's voice cracked. Can you not make everything about them? I looked at my son. Really looked at him. He seemed smaller somehow, caught between his father's ambition and my grief. But there was something else in his expression. A desperation I couldn't quite understand. Ivy placed her hand over his. Maybe we should go, she said softly. As they stood to leave, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen lighting up with a message. The name Asher flashed briefly before she tucked it away. After they left, Griffin approached me with that practiced, concerned expression. "You're not thinking clearly, sweetheart. Let me handle things for a while." I stepped back from his reaching hand. "You keep saying that, but I'm starting to wonder exactly what you're handling and why." His smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. In that split second, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The same calculating look I'd noticed the night my parents died. I needed answers, and I knew just where to start. Tomorrow, I would meet James and find out what my father had left for me. But first, I needed to know more about this mysterious Asher who was messaging my future daughter-in-law. Meeting James felt like a betrayal, even though Griffin was the one I couldn't trust anymore. I parked 3 blocks from the coffee shop, checking my rearview mirror twice before getting out. Paranoid? Maybe, but after what I'd found this morning, I couldn't be too careful. James was already waiting, his usually immaculate soup wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Dark circles under his eyes matched my own. "You look terrible," I said, sliding into the booth. "You should see the other guy." He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Did you bring it?" I pulled out my father's letter, found hidden in his desk drawer that morning. "Tell me what this means, James." He glanced around before reading it, his face growing paler. The letter was typical Dad, straight to the point. "If anything happens to your mother and me, don't trust the numbers. Griffin's been cooking the books. Get James to show you the real accounts. Your father suspected something was wrong months ago," James said quietly. "The company's finances weren't adding up. Large transfers to offshore accounts, unauthorized investments in Griffin's name, shell companies. But we traced them. Your husband's been embezzling for years," James said, his voice low and tense. "Small amounts at first, then bigger ones. Your father was planning to confront him the day of the accident." My coffee turned to acid in my stomach. "The brakes?" James nodded grimly. "The mechanic who serviced their car the week before disappeared along with all maintenance records." My phone buzzed. A text from Griffin. "Where are you?" "Important meeting with the board at 2. Need you here." "There's more," James said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Your father kept detailed records, but be careful who sees these. Someone at the company is helping Griffin, someone with access." The coffee shop door chimed, and Ivy walked in, arm in arm with a young man I didn't recognize. They were too engrossed in each other to notice us. The way he touched her arm, whispered in her ear. This wasn't just a friendly meeting. "Who's that?" I whispered to James. "Asher Reynolds, Tessa's son. He worked as an intern at the company last summer." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. The same Asher from Ivy's phone. My phone buzzed again. Griffin called. "Rowan says you're not at yoga class like you told him." "I need to go," I said, standing abruptly. "But James, there's one more thing. Rowan's getting married next weekend to that girl right there. Tell me what you know about her." James's face went white. "Ivy? She's not who she claims to be. She was involved in a fraud case last year, but the charges were dropped when the main witness disappeared. Asher was supposed to testify." Another text came through. "Found your car. Coming to get you." "James, I have to go." The coffee shop door opened again. Griffin stood there, his charming smile firmly in place, but his eyes were cold as he scanned the room. They landed on me, then shifted to James, and finally to the USB drive still on the table. "Darling," he said, walking over, I've been looking everywhere for you." He reached for the drive, but I snatched it first, clutching it in my fist. "Griffin," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just having coffee with an old friend." His smile didn't waver as he gripped my arm. "How nice." "James, always a pleasure. But if you'll excuse us, my wife and I have a board meeting to attend." As Griffin steered me toward the door, I caught one last glimpse of Ivy and Asher. They were watching us now, their expressions unreadable, but just before we left, I saw Ivy pull out her phone and make a call. In the car, Griffin drove in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You know, sweetheart, curiosity can be dangerous, especially when it comes to family matters." I thought of my parents' car, of missing brake records and disappeared witnesses, of my son rushing into marriage with a woman connected to it all. "Is that a threat?" I asked quietly. He patted my hand, his wedding ring glinting in the sunlight. "Of course not. Just a friendly warning. After all, we wouldn't want anything to happen to Rowan, would we?" The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. Whatever was on it, whatever truth it revealed, I knew one thing for certain. I was running out of time to save my son. I hadn't spoken to Tessa in nearly 2 years, not since she moved across the country after her divorce, but seeing her number in James's contact list felt like finding a lifeline. I called her from a burner phone I'd bought that morning, sitting in my car 3 towns over from home. She answered on the first ring. "I've been waiting for your call. You knew about Griffin." "Honey, I tried to warn you 20 years ago." Her voice softened. "But that's not why you're calling, is it? It's about Asher and Ivy." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd lost connection. Finally, Tessa spoke, her voice tight. "Where are you?" "We need to talk in person." An hour later, I sat across from her in a dingy motel room. Tessa hadn't changed much, still fierce, still direct. She pulled out a laptop and opened a file. "First, you need to see this." She turned the screen toward me. It showed security camera footage of Griffin meeting with Ivy in a parking garage. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. They knew each other. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Ivy worked for Griffin last year under a different name. She was part of his scheme to embezzle from your father's company. When things got hot, she disappeared along with nearly $2 million. My hands started shaking, and now she's marrying my son. It gets worse. Tessa pulled up another file. Asher was working at your father's company when he discovered the fraud. He was going to testify, but she swallowed hard. Someone threatened his life. My son had to go into hiding. But I just saw him with Ivy at the coffee shop because he's trying to get evidence against her and Griffin. They don't know he's my son. He changed his name, his appearance. He's been working undercover, trying to protect. She stopped abruptly as my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email now." I opened my email to find a video attachment. The thumbnail showed Rowan sitting in what looked like a warehouse. My heart stopped. "Play it," Tessa said quietly. Rowan's face filled the screen. He looked terrified. "Mom, if you're watching this, I'm okay, but you need to stop digging. Please just let it go. Sign the company over to Dad like he wants, and everything will be fine. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The video ended. Another text came through. "You have 24 hours. The paperwork is on your desk at home." They're using my son to force my hand. My voice cracked. I have to give them what they want. "No," Tessa said firmly. "That's exactly what they expect. But we have something they don't know about. She reached into her bag and pulled out a familiar-looking USB drive. James gave you a copy, but this is the original. What Griffin took from you was a decoy. She smiled grimly. James and I have been working together for months, gathering evidence. We just needed you to wake up and see the truth. My phone buzzed again. Griffin coming home soon, darling. We need to discuss the company transfer. He's getting desperate. Tessa observed. Men like Griffin get sloppy when they're desperate. I thought of my parents' accident, of Rowan's fear in that video, of all the signs I'd ignored for years. What's our next move? First, you go home. Act normal. Let Griffin think he's won. Tessa's eyes hardened. Meanwhile, Asher will get Rowan out. We have people in place. And then we spring the trap. But Alara, she gripped my hand. Are you ready for what comes next? Because once we start this, there's no going back. Griffin will lose everything. I thought of my father's letter, of James's warnings, of my son's frightened face. Griffin already took everything from me. Now it's my turn. As I drove home, I composed my face into the mask of submission Griffin would expect. Let him think he'd broken me. Let him believe he'd won. But for the first time since my parents died, I felt something other than grief or fear. I felt powerful, and I finally understood. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. Sometimes it burns everything to the ground. The wedding rehearsal dinner felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. I watched Ivy work the room, her white dress a mockery of innocence, as she charmed our family friends. Griffin stood nearby, playing the proud father-in-law, perfectly. Too perfectly. Asher was there too, posing as Ivy's childhood friend. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave an imperceptible nod, the signal we'd arranged. Beautiful evening, isn't it? Ivy appeared at my elbow, making me jump. Though I wish we could have held it at the estate. Griffin mentioned it might be possible after the company transfer. My champagne glass trembled slightly. Did he? Oh yes, her smile didn't reach her eyes. He has such wonderful plans for the company. Rowan's so excited to learn the business from his father. Where's my son? I asked, my expression flickering. Ivy's expression flickered. Probably just running late. You know how boys are. Do I? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. How do you know Asher? The color drained from her face before she could respond. Griffin appeared between us. Everything all right here? His hand gripped my arm, warning disguised as affection. My phone buzzed. A text from Tessa. Package secured. Wait for signal. Relief flooded through me. They had Rowan. He was safe now for the next part of the plan. Actually, I said, raising my voice slightly, Ivy was just about to explain how she knows Asher Reynolds. The room didn't quite go silent, but the atmosphere shifted. Griffin's fingers dug deeper into my arm. Darling, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time. I pulled away from him. Before we welcome Ivy into our family, maybe she'd like to explain the $2 million she stole from my father's company. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ivy's sweet facade cracked. You don't know what you're talking about, she hissed. Don't I? Like I don't know about the offshore accounts, the threatened witnesses, my parents' break lines? Griffin stepped forward, his charm turning dangerous. Alara, you're upset. Let's discuss this privately. No more private discussions. I turned to face our guests. My husband and his accomplice here murdered my parents. They're holding my son hostage to force me to sign over the company, and I have proof." The room erupted in chaos. Ivy bolted for the door, but crashed straight into Asher. Two plainclothes officers emerged from the crowd, moving toward Griffin, but Griffin just laughed. "Proof? You mean that USB drive? Check your purse, darling." My blood ran cold. I reached for my bag, but I already knew the drive was gone. Amazing what a good pickpocket can do. Griffin smirked. And as for Rowan, he pulled out his phone, showing me a live video feed of our son, still captive, with a timestamp from 2 minutes ago. "That's impossible." I whispered. "Tessa said." "Tessa?" Griffin's smile widened. "You mean your old friend who's been working for me all along? The one who gave me every detail of your little plan." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. I looked for Asher, but he was gone. The officers had vanished too. "You see, darling," Griffin continued, "you're not the only one who can set a trap. Now shall we discuss that company transfer?" My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "Mom, don't trust Tessa. She's not who you think, but I'm okay for real this time. Check the kitchen." I backed away from Griffin, my mind racing. The kitchen where Asher had been setting up the catering earlier, where he'd insisted on handling the champagne himself. "Actually," I said, lifting my glass, "let's have a toast. First to new beginnings." Griffin's smug expression faltered as he watched me raise the champagne to my lips. For the first time, real fear crept into his eyes. "What did you do?" I smiled, channeling his own cold confidence. "You're not the only one who can play games, darling. Now, about those brake lines." The sound of police sirens filled the air outside, and this time they were real. Griffin lunged for the door, but it was already too late. Everything was about to change, and for once, I was the one in control. The police interrogation room felt colder than it should have. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the two-way mirror, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Griffin was in custody, but he was still. "Mrs. Whitman," Detective Morris said, sliding crime scene photos across the table. "These were taken at your parents' accident. Notice anything unusual?" I looked away. I couldn't bear to see those images again. "Your fingerprints were found on the brake line housing," she continued. "Care to explain that?" "That's impossible." My voice cracked. "I never." "We also found traces of the same champagne you served at the rehearsal dinner in your father's system." The talk screen showed it was laced with a substance that would have impaired his driving. The room started spinning. "No, Griffin did this. He confessed." Morris raised an eyebrow. "Yes, he did. He confessed that you planned it all, that you were angry about your father's refusal to let you take over the company, that you recruited Ivy to help manipulate your son into marriage as a distraction." "That's insane." I stood up so fast my chair clattered backward. "Where's Rowan? I need to see my son." "Sit down, Mrs. Whitman." Morris's voice hardened. "Rowan's with his father. Griffin's been released." "Released?" The word felt like ash in my mouth. His confession was very compelling, especially with the evidence Tessa provided. A knock at the door interrupted us. Another detective entered, whispering something to Morris. She nodded, then turned back to me. "Your lawyer's here." But instead of my attorney, Ivy Ton, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase, she looked nothing like the sweet, innocent girl who'd nearly married my son. "Hello, Alara," she said, sitting down. "I'll be representing you today." "Like hell you will." "Actually," she smiled, "I'm your only option. Your assets have been frozen." Griffin's evidence was quite thorough. The only person who can help you now is me. Morris left us alone. As soon as the door closed, Ivy's smile vanished. Here's the deal, she said. Sign these papers, transferring your voting rights in the company to Griffin, and all the evidence disappears, including the real footage of what happened that night on Mountain Pass Road. My blood ran cold. What footage? She pulled out her phone, showing me a video. It was dark, grainy, but I could make out my parents' car and another vehicle forcing them off the road. Behind the wheel, my stomach lurched, was Tessa. Your friend was very helpful, Ivy said, though she didn't know the whole plan. Griffin can be very persuasive when he wants something. Where's my son? I demanded. The real Rowan, not whatever decoy you used at the rehearsal. Safe for now, but that could change depending on your decision. My hands shook as I reached for the papers. If I sign these, you go to prison for your parents' murder. Griffin gets the company, and Rowan stays safe, believing his mother killed his grandparents out of greed. She shrugged. Everyone wins, except you, of course. I thought of my father's letter, of all the evidence I'd gathered now twisted and used against me. I thought of Asher, who disappeared with the real USB drive. And I thought of Rowan, somewhere out there, probably hating me. Time's running out, Ivy said, checking her watch. The DA is filing charges in an hour. What's it going to be? I picked up the pen, seeing no other choice, but as I pressed it to paper, my phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. Don't sign. Kitchen camera footage uploaded. Check the news. Ivy's phone rang immediately. Her face went pale as she listened. When she hung up, her composure had cracked. What did you do? She whispered. I set down the pen, remembering the hidden camera Asher had installed in the kitchen during the rehearsal dinner, the one that had captured every word of Griffin and Ivy's private conversation about my parents' murder. You know, I said quietly, my father taught me something important about business. Always have a backup plan. Ivy lunged for the door, but it was already opening. This time, real federal agents walked in, and behind them, safe and sound, was Rowan. The game wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I could see a way to win. The federal agents had Griffin cornered in his office at my father's company, our company. I watched through the glass walls as he paced, still trying to maintain control, even as his world crumbled. When I walked in, his smile was as practiced as ever. Come to gloat, darling? No. I set the USB drive on his desk. I came to understand, his eyes fixed on the drive. That's not the real one. It is. The kitchen footage was just a bonus. I sat in my father's chair. You know what? I can't figure out why you needed Ivy. You already had everything, everything. He laughed bitterly. I had your father's contempt, your family's money hanging over my head, a son who'd rather work in a garage than follow in my footsteps. The door opened. Rowan walked in, followed by Asher. Griffin's composure cracked slightly. Speaking of following in footsteps, Asher said, Want to tell them about the other companies? The ones before you married Alara? Griffin's face went pale. You're bluffing. 3 marriages, Asher continued. 3 wealthy families. 3 tragic accidents. But you got sloppy this time. You let Ivy keep records. Ivy's dead. Griffin snapped. The room went silent. Rowan stepped forward, his hands shaking. What did you say? She knew too much. Griffin replied, threatened to expose everything unless I paid her more. Poor girl, driving so fast on Mountain Pass Road. Griffin's smile returned, colder than ever. Like mother, like son, always choosing the wrong people to trust. Rowan lunged forward, but Asher caught him. I stayed seated, watching my husband's facade finally crack. You know what your father told me the night he died? Griffin's voice shook. That he was changing his will, leaving everything to Rowan, directly cutting us both out. I couldn't let that happen. I deserved. You deserved what? I stood slowly. To kill my parents? To traumatize our son? To murder an innocent girl because she wanted a bigger cut? Innocent? He scoffed. She was working with Asher the whole time. They thought they could outplay me, but I'm always 3 steps ahead. 2 steps, Asher corrected. Ivy's not dead. The office door opened again. Ivy walked in, very much alive, flanked by federal agents. But she wasn't wearing her usual sweet smile. She looked terrified. Tell them, Asher urged her. Tell them what really happened that night. Ivy's voice trembled. I was supposed to get close to Rowan, help Griffin access the estate after his parents died. But then Asher warned me what happened to Griffin's other wives, their families. You were never going to let any of us live. I realized once you had control of the company, business. Griffin said flatly, nothing personal. Nothing personal. Rowan's voice cracked. You killed my grandparents, tried to kill Mom, used me as bait. How is that not personal? I gave you everything. Griffin shouted, his calm finally shattering. Both of you, and you never appreciated it. Never saw what I could be if you just got out of my way. He reached into his desk drawer. The agents drew their weapons, but I held up my hand. The gun's not there, Griffin. I removed it this morning, along with the evidence you thought you had against me. I stepped closer. You want to know your biggest mistake? Thinking you had to become someone else to be worthy. My father would have given you everything if you'd just been honest. Liar, he whispered, but his hands were shaking. Check your email, Asher said. The last message your father-in-law sent before he died. The one you never saw because Ivy intercepted it. Griffin's computer dinged as he read the message. All color drained from his face. A partnership, he said quietly. / He was offering me a real place in the family. I finished. But you couldn't see it. You were too busy planning our deaths. The agents moved in, reading Griffin his rights as they led him away. He looked back one last time. I really did love you, he said. Both of you. I know, I replied. That's what makes this tragedy not just a crime. After he was gone, Rowan and I stood in the empty office, surrounded by the wreckage of our family's legacy. But as I looked at my son, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Strength. Not Griffin's false confidence, but something real, something like hope. 6 months after Griffin's arrest, I stood in my father's office, my office now, watching the sunrise over the city. The trial had ended yesterday, 25 years, no possibility of parole. Justice, they called it. But justice felt hollow when you had to rebuild a life from ashes. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Rowan entered, carrying 2 coffee cups. He'd started working at the company 3 months ago, learning from the ground up like my father had always wanted. Thought you might need this, he said, setting a cup on my desk. Long day ahead. The board meeting. He nodded. Ivy's testimony is being presented. Her immunity deal went through. I studied my son's face, searching for signs of the pain that name used to bring, but he seemed calmer now, stronger. You know, he said, I found something in Dad's old files yesterday. Want to see it? He pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before. Griffin holding newborn Rowan, looking not at the camera, but at his son with pure, unguarded love. He wasn't always the monster we know now, Rowan said quietly. No, I agreed. But that makes it worse, doesn't it? Knowing he was capable of better. The intercom buzzed. My assistant's voice was hesitant. Mrs. Whitman, there's someone here to see you from the prison. Rowan tensed. Mom, you don't have to. It's okay. I squeezed his hand. I need to do this. The visitor wasn't Griffin. He wasn't allowed visitors yet. It was Tessa. She looked smaller in her prison uniform, all her fierce energy contained now. You came, she said simply. You asked. I gestured for her to sit, though I'm not sure why. She placed a manila envelope on my desk. Because I owe you the truth. The whole truth, not just what came out in court. Inside were letters spanning 20 years, correspondence between Griffin and Tessa, revealing a relationship that started long before I met either of them. He was my first love, Tessa said. When he chose you instead, well, revenge is a patient game. I helped him, guided him, thinking we'd be together once you and your family were gone. I never thought he'd. Her voice cracked. I never thought he'd actually kill anyone. But he did. My voice was steady. And you helped him. Yes, she met my eyes. And I'll spend the rest of my life paying for it. But there's something else you should know. Something about your father. She pulled out one final letter. As I read it, my hands began to shake. He knew, I whispered. All along, he knew what Griffin was planning. The partnership offer, the will change. It was a trap. Your father was always 3 steps ahead, Tessa said. He just didn't expect Griffin to move so fast, or me to be so good at erasing evidence. The intercom buzzed again. Mrs. Whitman, the board is ready. I stood, gathering the letters. Thank you, Tessa, for finally telling the truth. There's one more thing, she hesitated. Asher, he's really my nephew. Not my son. His parents were Griffin's first victims. I raised him to help me get revenge. But in the end, he chose justice instead. He chose to save your family rather than destroy it. As security led her away, I thought about choices, the ones that destroy us and the ones that save us. About how revenge and justice sometimes wore the same face. Rowan was waiting outside. Ready? I looked at my son, seeing echoes of both his father and grandfather in his face. But mostly I saw himself. Someone who'd faced darkness and chosen light. Almost, I said. Just need to make one call. I already knew what I had to do, so I called the prison. Because finding the strength to comprehend why individuals break in the first place can sometimes be more difficult than administering punishment. I said, hello, when they responded. I'd like to schedule a visit with Griffin Whitman. Because some stories finish with understanding rather than justice or retribution. And perhaps, just possibly, that is the greatest triumph of all.